Welcome back, A-level geographers. Let's get down to business. So to get those top tier marks in Edexcel geography, we're talking about hitting your level 3 and your level 4 marks. You're going to need more than textbook definitions, and you're going to need more than just simple bog standard theory. And you're probably going to need more than those textbook case studies. What examiners reward more than anything are recent pieces of case study evidence. So I've selected 9 stories for you from around 2024, 2025 and 2026 that perfectly illustrate globalization key ideas 3.1 to 3.9. We're going to go through each of those in turn. So let's dive in. Hold it right there though. Before we dive into globalization, let's talk about May the 21st. Now we're just coming off the back of what was a dream of a paper 1 paper. Absolute dream. But if you're now feeling that paper 2 pressure, maybe it's your Achilles heel, I am running another massive 2-day masterclass this weekend to get you as exam ready as possible for that paper 2 next Thursday. In those 2 days, we're going to be smashing through the entire core content for that paper 2 paper. We'll be covering globalization and we'll be covering superpowers. That'll be on the Saturday. On the Sunday, that's when we break it down into our optional modules. First thing, you'll either go into the regen room or the diverse room. In the afternoon, it's either HHRI or it's migration. Whichever your optional modules, we've got you covered. No one gets left behind. And remember, this isn't just a boring lecture. We use active recall and we test your knowledge live. So both me and another expert tutor give you the question, you go away, you see what you know, we fill in the gaps afterwards. Plus, I'm going to be hosting a live Q&A straight after both days from 3:30 till 4:30. It's that hour that you can use to ask me absolutely anything you like about paper 2 content, paper 2 exam technique. It's where you get your specific questions answered. But in addition to this, if you want to go beyond that content and master the marks, this is where you can also choose to opt in for our 5-day intensive. We bolt on 3 extra days to the weekend, purely dedicated to exam technique. We'll show you exactly how to use that content to structure your 4s, your 6s, your 8s and your 20s, just so all that content goes in the right place, in the right way, so the examiner's got no choice but to give you the marks. So if you want to solidify that grade before May 21st, links are in my bio for both of those programs. $24.99 for the weekend, $34.99 for the 5-day intensive. Get yourself booked on now. All right, let's get back to the case studies for globalization. First up, key idea 3.1, which is all about the acceleration of globalization through technology. So before we go anywhere, let's look at what acceleration of globalization actually means. So, something that everyone is talking about is cryptocurrencies. The growth of cryptocurrencies is a consequence of increasing flows of information, or the capacity for certain systems within the globalized world to move new forms of currency. What this is allowing countries to do is move capital from one place to another faster than has originally been allowed. Previously, countries have relied on SWIFT, but now people are bypassing that system and they're being allowed to utilize these cryptocurrencies where transactions can be instantaneous. So in 2025 and 2026, the story of global flows shifted as countries like El Salvador and Venezuela started to use these cryptocurrencies. They used decentralized networks to bypass the traditional, more westernized or Western-controlled financial systems. El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender and uses the Lightning Network, which is a layer 2 solution to settle international remittances instantly for citizens without bank accounts. Meanwhile, Venezuela has integrated USDT, and it's integrated this into its state-led oil sales with the specific purpose of bypassing the US-controlled financial systems and SWIFT. So why is it quicker than SWIFT? Well, traditional SWIFT transfers are constrained by multi-step settlement processes and intermediary banks, typically taking around 2 to 5 business days. In contrast, blockchain-based technologies, or blockchain-based transfers, can settle these transactions in minutes because they remove the need for bureaucratic multi-bank reconciliation. So with this new system in place, stablecoin transfers in 2025 reached a staggering 10.6 trillion, proving that digital capital movement is now a primary rail for the flow of capital, particularly in emerging economies that are trying to bypass the previously US-led system. So then we move on to key idea 3.2, which is all about political and economic economic decision making. What we do in this key idea is we look at the major players who write the rules for the global economy. At the international scale, we have the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. When we go to a more continental scale, we go to look at trade blocs, and the major trade blocs that you probably will have studied are the EU and ASEAN. These organisations all promote neoliberal economic policies, the idea that things should flow freely with as fewer barriers as possible, removing those protectionist measures so that more and more flows can flow across border without any restrictions. For your 2026 mocks, you'll probably need to look at updates from any of these trade blocs, because looking forward to the future, trade blocs are the future. Institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO are becoming increasingly redundant in the face of global superpowers and these large trade blocs and their economic powers. We're also increasingly looking to the Far East and Southeast Asian economies, where the majority of the growth of the global economy is taking place. A huge case study for this year is the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, or DEFA for short, and it's the world's first major region-wide digital trade pact. So why does this matter for your exam? Because it's once again showing that political decision-making can have an influence on the acceleration of globalization, which we've already been through, which is the increasing pace and volume of global flows across borders. So across the ASEAN trade bloc, by harmonizing rules for digital payments, e-commerce, and cross-border data flows, ASEAN is effectively rewiring the digital economy. So by removing these digital trade barriers, ASEAN's digital economy is set to double in size by 2030, reaching a worth of around $2 trillion. Meanwhile, while your textbook says that institutions like the WTO are like the global referees of global trade, they've been increasingly sidelined, benched more recently. We're increasingly seeing the WTO becoming redundant as we see these enormous trade wars taking place between your global superpowers. The biggest issue? Well, the US effectively blocked the appointment of any judges for what is the equivalent of the WTO's Supreme Court, let's say. So this Supreme Court can no longer hear any trade appeals. So when countries like the US or China impose these very large tariffs, the losing country is effectively appealing to what would amount to a legal void, where the ruling doesn't really have any legal force. So we're effectively entering a year of tariff consequences, and therefore the WTO recently slashed its 2026 growth projections to just 0.5%, down from a projected 1.8%, specifically because of these tariff shocks. So in your mocks, you can very much use this as a counter argument to the original argument that you might have put forward, that political decision making is very important in the acceleration of globalization. What you would probably say is that it's important to a point, but the world that used to be one of multilateralism is now slowly but surely moving to one of bilateralism, where there are agreements between individual nations. Now let's look at key idea 3.3, which is all about nations being detached from globalization. In your exam, you might be asked why some places are left behind while the rest of the world prospers. While North Korea is switched off for political reasons, Chad is the perfect case study for physical and environmental reasons. First, let's talk about landlocked geography. Chad is often called the dead heart of Africa. Its capital is over 1,000 kilometers from the nearest port, which is in Cameroon. Without a coastline, Chad has no access to global sea trade, making it incredibly expensive and difficult to import and export technology and goods. This has a huge impact on their development and therefore a huge impact on the amount of FDI that they'll receive. Then there's the environmental barrier, the Sahel. Chad straddles the Sahara Desert and the semi-arid Sahel region, where harsh climates and extreme water scarcity make the development of the agricultural sector extremely difficult. In 2026, this is being made far worse by the process of desertification, which is being made far worse by the process of global warming. Lake Chad, which was once a vital lifeline for their economy, has shrunk by over 90% since the 1960s. Finally, in more recent stories, in 2026, the country is facing a massive humanitarian crisis, hosting over 1.4 million refugees from neighbouring conflicts in Sudan and the Central African Republic. This strains what little infrastructure the country has, keeping its focus on basic survival rather than integration into the globalized world. So if you get a 12-mark question on why some places are detached, use Chad to prove that it isn't always choice like in North Korea. And anyway, North Korea is not as detached as they would have us believe. It's actually integrating further into the global economy, but through the underground flows. Let's look at the Russia-North Korea kind of quasi-alliance that developed in 2025. This relationship evolved from a simple military deal to obviously assist in the invasion of Ukraine, and it's developed into a deeper economic partnership. They aren't just sending shells, they're also sending thousands of labourers and technical workers to Russia in exchange for food and energy, as well as a little bit of military technology that they don't have yet. But the most shocking way that they're integrating is through the digital capital flows that we've already discussed. In 2025, North Korea's state-backed hackers stole over $2 billion worth of cryptocurrencies. Scoundrels. So they're becoming this rogue crypto superpower that uses global blockchain networks to bypass those US systems. Even tourism, one of the most visible of global flows, is very cautiously reopening. In February 2025, the Raison Special Economic Zone briefly reopened to Western tourists for the first time in 5 years. I mean, it was a limited test, but it just goes to show that if they want to integrate, then they can, whether it be through legitimate or illegitimate flows. So they're not in the same position as Chad, which doesn't necessarily have as much of a choice. So then we move on to key idea 3.4, which focuses on the impacts of the global shift. Remember, the global shift is the movement of manufacturing and services from the Old West to Southeast Asia, and then increasingly in the future, Africa. Now, for many of us, we would have studied China, but for 2026, the focus should be on Vietnam and how it's becoming the new high-tech workshop of Southeast Asia. This represents another shift in what we call the economic center of gravity, this time shifting towards Vietnam. While China is moving into high-end services, as per modernization theory, Vietnam has officially become the high-tech powerhouse. In 2025, electronics became the primary driver of Vietnam's economic growth, with total exports hitting a staggering 164 billion. So we're not just talking about cheap textiles anymore, we are talking about high-end electronic goods. We're talking semiconductors, we're talking AI research hubs, and we're talking those high-end smartphones. Now, as always, TNCs are the main driver here. Samsung now produces over half of its global supply in Vietnam. So even despite some of those trade tensions and those tariffs imposed by the US, Vietnam attracted over 30 billion in FDI as companies looked for alternatives to China as they were hit with those really high tariffs. This allowed them to avoid those rising costs and any risks associated with geopolitical tension. There's lots of benefits to this as well, because that's what we've got to look at in key idea 3.4. What are the benefits? What are the costs to people and environments? So while poverty has been slashed, which is an inevitable benefit of the global shift, Vietnam is now in the top 11 countries most vulnerable to climate change. The rapid industrialization has put enormous pressure on their energy grid, and that is causing severe environmental degradation. And you've got to ask, how do we get from growing energy demand to environmental degradation? Well, I'm going to take you through that now. The answer is the energy industrial nexus to power the factories making your tech. Vietnam's electricity demand is growing from anything between 12% to 16% per year. To keep the lights on and the assembly lines moving that fuels their economic growth, Vietnam still relies on fossil fuels for over half of its electricity. When these plants burn coal to meet the high energy demand, this combustion of this fossil fuel releases particulates, nitrous oxides, and these can lead to respiratory issues in people. It can also contaminate watercourses and lead to things like acid rain. And it's not just in the air. These thermal plants pull in billions of gallons of water for cooling, often dumping these back into the river at higher temperatures. This can kill local fish and disrupt local ecosystems, a process known as thermal pollution. So the environmental degradation here is a direct trade-off for speed. As of 2026, Vietnam is facing the twin challenges of meeting its massive energy demand while trying to also wean themselves off this fossil fuel dependency, which is leading to all of these environmental issues. And now we move on to key idea 3.5, which is all about the flows of people. While many of us often focus on low-wage labour migration from periphery to core countries and that idea of interdependency in these flows of people, say between like India and the UAE, where we have migrant workers and then they send remittances back to these countries, 2026 is the year of the elite remote worker, or digital nomads as they are increasingly becoming known as. So by 2026, over 50 countries have now formalized this nomad visa arrangement, turning this global talent into a new kind of floating flow of people, a transient group. These remote workers have specific skills in tech-based fields of work like website design, graphic design, coding, even investing. And countries offer them incentives, I guess, for living there. So this can offer many benefits to host nations, which is what we look at in Key Idea 3.5. Countries like Hungary and Portugal are now competing for these workers because they can bring untaxed foreign income directly into their country and then spend it in their economy. They spend on things like housing, high-end services, and local leisure, effectively acting as long-term tourists. In the Philippines and Nepal, they're even credited with improving local digital infrastructure and also mentoring local tech startups. But there's also a major cost for these host nations as well. Gentrification is taking place. Now, we've stolen that term from regenerating places. It essentially means the gradual improvement of an area when higher income individuals move in, but that ends up displacing lower income individuals. In places like Lisbon, house prices have soared by over 176% over the last decade, making it the most unaffordable capital in Europe in 2025. Local residents who earn some of the lowest salaries in the EU are being pushed to the outskirts because landlords are prioritizing these kind of high-end elite migrants. In Bali, this has led to a huge backlash, mainly over traffic, waste problems, and the commercialization of local culture. Very often these nomads will sit in cafes and say, oh, look, here I am in Bali doing my work. And this isn't necessarily what Bali is trying to portray as its local culture. But also, what about the source nations like the UK? This is where we see a kind of brain drain taking place. In 2024 alone, over 250,000 British nationals left the UK, 3 times more than originally estimated. Many are young, ambitious STEM professionals seeking a better quality of life and lower taxes abroad. For the UK, this means a huge loss of tax revenue generating workers and somewhat of a productivity collapse in vital sectors like technology and engineering. So in your mocks, you can use digital nomads to discuss that kind of host-source relationship and the costs and benefits in both cases. It's a real win for the nomad, but a real mixed bag for the host and definitely a loss for the source. So now we move on to Key Idea 3.6, which is this idea of cultural diffusion. What you've probably classically learnt about is this idea of westernization and Americanization, and that's very much been the way of things for certainly for the last couple of decades. Whereas now, as we move into 2026 and probably moving on to 2030, it's much more of a complex picture. It's more like a cultural fusion situation that we're seeing. Now, the specification defines cultural fusion as the spread of ideas, usually TNCs being at the forefront of this spread, but it can also be caused by global media and migration flows as well. And by 2025, Western culture has near enough penetrated every single corner of the globe. But here's the twist for you in your Paper 2 mocks this year. We're kind of entering a more multiplex world, if you like. So while Western TNCs like Apple and Disney do still dominate, they're not the only key players that we need to be looking at. So in 2025, influences from what we would call the global south, like K-pop and Bollywood and Japanese gaming, are becoming increasingly influential in shaping the cultures of other countries. And what it's doing is it's creating this kind of global fusion culture. So it's not just the West changing the rest of the world, it's the rest of the world also changing what it means to be part of Western culture. So as a prime example, non-English content on streaming platforms saw a 40% increase in viewership in 2025. This is driven by something that we call fusion hits. And this is a consequence of the growth of these emerging economies, which now account for 44% of international trade and 42% of global output. And this economic power is now translating into this kind of cultural soft power, if you like. Another area we're seeing this is in the fusion food market. It grew by 12% in 2025. Examples like Korean tacos and Indian pizzas are no longer niche, they're becoming a staple part of many menus in these global hubs. So youth culture now is increasingly valuing hybrid identities rather than assigning themselves to individual nations. And platforms like TikTok and YouTube are helping with this spread of culture. I don't know if anyone's seen the fusion trend of a croffle. See if you can guess what that is. It is the merging of a croissant and a waffle, which can go from a single cafe in South Korea to becoming a global trend within 48 hours. So the speed at which this hybridization of this global culture is taking place is hugely a consequence of these increasing flows of information. So if you get a question about cultural diffusion or the degree to which cultural diffusion is taking place, it might be a 12 marker. Don't just go down your typical Americanization route, Westernization route and talk about McDonald's and globalization. Start talking about this cultural hybridization, or use that as a really clever counterpoint. Once again, you're showing that you've got current case study knowledge and that you are analyzing the world as it develops and that you can link it to the theory of the specification. And then we move on to key idea 3.7, which is all about the degree to which globalization has contributed to either growing or reducing inequalities. Well, the answer is it has and it hasn't. It's always the case with geography. So in 2026, we're seeing the gaps between nations starting to shrink, but then when we go to within these nations, inequalities are growing almost exponentially. So one of the go-to reports that people often seek when they're looking for inequality figures is the Oxfam report. And their 2025 Inequality Inc. report stated that in 2024 alone, billionaire wealth growth surged by over $2 trillion, which is a rate of 3 times faster than the previous year. So while the 1% in the global north are becoming almost like your modern day aristocrats, nearly half of humanity still lives on less than $5.50 a day. So in your mocks, it's absolutely essential that you mention the Gini coefficient when referring to this economic inequality within countries. This shows a graph or a chart, and depending on how far that curve moves from that straight line, that's the degree of inequality within certain countries. So whereabouts is this happening? Well, places like China and Bangladesh have lifted millions out of poverty, and a major part of this is the global shift of industry. However, now in China, the richest 10% own over half of the nation's wealth. This is a major within country inequality, and this is very much more pertinent in the global south than it is in the global north, just because there is a concentration of these low income industries or these low income forms of employment. Wages in the global south are still around 85% lower than in the global north. So why is this income inequality happening? Well, we've got to look at where the economy has been heading over the last 5 to 10 years, and that is in the increased exploitation of critical minerals. Part of that is because of the growth of semiconductors and electronics that are fueling development in the developed world. But the other part of this is the transition to green energies. That green transition has created a new heist, if you like, on these critical mineral resources. So TNCs are extracting billions of dollars worth of resources from African nations such as DRC. But poor governance within these countries mean that wealth redistribution is insufficient to close that gap within these economies, and therefore local ruling elites and TNCs are making billions of dollars worth of profit from the exploitation of these resources. And what we're seeing here is the development of a new form of neo-colonialism based around this idea that we need these critical resources for the green transition. In addition to this, it's also leading to local forms of environmental degradation. Mining operations in particular are associated with the use of materials that will lead to toxic chemicals making their way into local ecosystems, particularly aquatic ecosystems and soils. So if you get an essay on whether globalization is successful or whether it does contribute to decreasing or growing inequalities, you can very much use that phrase of double-edged sword. It is shrinking the gap between what we would call the global north and the global south, but inequalities within countries are, if anything, getting worse. And you can use the fact that the world is on track for creating its very first trillionaire, and that is more than likely to happen within the decade. So we move on swiftly to key idea 3.8, which is all about political political and social tensions that are a consequence of globalization. Globalization doesn't just move goods, it moves people and it moves cultures, as we've already looked at in Key Idea 3.6. And many nations are hitting the brakes on accepting these goods and accepting these cultures, and many are transitioning now to more nationalist sentiments as somewhat of a counterforce to this global integration. The big story for your mocks in 2026 is the rise of far-right nationalist parties. Now, these movements have moved from being fringe organisations to making themselves known within the heart of many national parties. Parties like Reform in the UK and France's National Rally are now leading many of the opinion polls and participating in many major EU decisions. They argue that globalism has left people behind. It's benefited the elites and it's left people behind. In addition to this, it has eroded a national identity that many of these communities hold very dear to their hearts. So why is this happening? Well, it's a perceived loss of control in many respects. In 2025, the UK saw a significant increase in anti-migration protests, fueled by concerns over asylum accommodation, cultural change, and the perceived increases in crime that came alongside. For many voters, the free movement of people is seen as a threat to their economic security and to the national identity that they hold so dear. And this has led to a vicious cycle where mainstream political parties are now adopting these more nationalist standpoints. But it isn't just about migration, it's also about sovereignty as well in 2026. Many of the world's nations are shifting towards economic nationalism as well. Major powers abandoning multilateral institutions like the WTO, and this has resulted in trade wars between big nations with large economies, with negative impacts on global supply chain. You'll seem increasingly irate at the fact that globalization has benefited the top and that local communities and local industries have been left behind, resulting in many nations or in many local communities in spirals of decline to pursue their own interests in terms of unilateral tariffs. So we can recycle the stuff we've used in 3.2 and use it in this tensions part of the specification. So if you get an 8 marker on political tensions, look at the current political landscape, look at the current global economic landscape and cite this concept of nationalism. Explain that the current backlash isn't just a rejection of the globalized world, but a demand for national borders to regain their importance and shield against these global shocks causing these large inequalities and rapid and what is perceived as unsustainable forms of migration. That is the kind of high-level geographic analysis that examiners are looking to see from you, and for you to link it to current global events and globalization theory. And then finally we reach Key Idea 3.9, which is globalization has caused this mess, so what are we going to do about it? One of the core things that we need to focus on in 3.9 is this idea that we have become and are still moving towards becoming this globalized consumer society. If you remember modernization theory, steps 1 to 5, step 5, as a place modernizes, they become a high mass consumption society. So they're no longer just producers producing these goods, they are now, with increasing disposable income, able to purchase certain things. The big news in 2026 is that the environmental bill is now due. So one of the biggest challenges to ethical consumption today is ultra fast fashion, ultra fast clothing, and the logistics that go into supporting them. If you think about platforms like Temu and Shein, they promote the whole shop like a billionaire mentality, producing goods for far cheaper than their competitors, taking advantages of economies of scale. But the environmental cost to this is staggering. Temu, for example, relies on air freight, shipping millions of individual small packages from China. So a single 1 kilogram package, because of the way it's transported, can produce around 5 kilograms of CO2, 20 to 30 times more than via sea freight. So what are nations doing about this? Well, the EU in 2025 ended the tax-free loophole for small packages to try and level the playing field, if you like, by incorporating this protectionist measure, and that is also a way of protecting their local suppliers that are more ethical. This is a response we're seeing increasingly, that move towards localism. This is the idea that we should support local jobs and local tradespeople, and what this does, it reduces food miles and therefore reduces the carbon footprint of consumption and trade. So you may have studied towns like Totnes in Devon, where localism is very much in place, and they even use their own localized currency. Some communities even supporting the whole economy. So instead of the old take, make, but the real game changer in 2026, and this is definitely something you should bring use it until it becomes obsolete and then throw it away into landfill, more and more companies are now producing products that are designed to be repaired rather than replaced. So brands like Patagonia and IKEA are now producing with longevity in mind. In addition to this, the EU has introduced new laws in 2025 and 2026 that ban planned obsolescence. This is where companies deliberately make their products break, essentially, or become useless after a certain amount of time, so that you then have to replace them with a new product. But obviously there is always that dilemma. Where there is a more ethical standpoint, there are increased costs. Are they available or accessible for lower income families? So there's always that kind of trade-off between those two things, and this is where you can be really evaluative with this key idea. And this is what's known as the action-intention gap. The intention is there, but will it actually translate to action when the reality of making these ethical consumer choices actually kicks in? So there we go. That's the rundown, 3.1 to 3.9, and it should absolutely be an aim of yours to include the most recent case studies alongside your key ideas. But remember, theory is ever important. Don't just do the whole case study dump. You've got to link these things together. Take the case study, take the theory that it relates to, and be evaluative with that content. Okay, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next video.